In general, my philosophy is I want to dictate the terms on how and where I hit that ball. I don't want the ball dictating that to me. So I don't want to rush in and have to hit this ball at a high point. And the problem with that is, depending on how my opponents hit that ball, that crest or that high point has all these variations to it, right? So now I have to be able to hit the ball well here and here and here and here and here. Same thing on the backhand side. So the ball is dictating, my opponents have dictated to me how I'm going to hit that ball if I'm trying to hit it at its crest. Versus if I will stay back a little bit longer, back a little bit further, wait a little bit longer for that ball to come off that crest and come down to a more consistent spot, which is down around my knee. I'll talk about that later in a different video. Then that ball is more consistent. I'm hitting that ball on my terms and in the same location more often, and I'm not having to hit the ball at different heights. Now that sounds like nirvana, Pollyanna, it's like the ideal situation, but that's the goal, right? I want to have a goal that says, I want to hit this ball on my terms, again when I can. Sometimes it's out of my control. But if I'm all the way back here, my opponents give me a shorter ball, like not down on my feet, so now I have some options about how long I can wait and how high I'm going to hit this ball. If I will be relaxed a little bit more, and if I'm more relaxed, my shots generally go better across the net. More relaxed, letting that ball come down, so I'm not in a rush to get up here and hit it as quickly as I can and have all these different heights that I'm going to hit that ball at. I let that ball crest, I let that ball start to come down, and now I'm starting to hit this in a more familiar, more consistent location, more consistent height off of that floor. And now in general, my consistency goes up because more of those balls I'm hitting are more and more consistently in the same location relative to my body. Let's talk about the flight of the ball and where in its flight you want to hit this ball. So thinking of this ball's coming in, it's going to bounce off the floor, come up off the floor and crest. And if I don't hit it, it's going to bounce again. So there's two bounce points here. And this ball does this nice little arc, this nice little arch between those two bounces. The hardest place to hit this ball is just after that first bounce. So just as it comes up off the floor, and you know this because as people hit balls at your feet, those are really hard to return into control. A lot of times what will happen is even if we can get our paddle on it well, it's going to hit the paddle and come up off of the paddle because it's coming up off the floor and its trajectory is upwards. And so you're going to either end up not controlling that or giving a high ball for your opponents to slam on you. The second worst place to hit the ball, in my opinion, is at the top of that arch where that ball crests at the top. The main reason is that the ball is weightless. It still has mass, but it doesn't have much inertia. If you've seen videos where these pilots or these people are in the back in the cabin of the airplane, pilot comes up and dives and they're floating inside the cabin of this airplane, they become weightless because the pilot has started a descent and they're just essentially free falling, so they don't have any mass. Well, they have mass, they just don't have inertia. And so at the top, at the crest here, this ball it's pretty weightless. And so for me to hit this with my paddle here, I describe it as a one-person hug. So if you've ever gone in to hug somebody and you hug them, but they don't hug you back, you can kind of feel how weird that is, versus when they hug you back. So now I'm hugging the person, they're hugging me back, and can be really good contact there, depending on how you hug. And so as my paddle would then hit this ball at the top of that crest, where that ball crests in that arch, then it's almost like that one-person hug. My paddle wants to grab that ball, and it can hit the ball and grab the ball, but the ball doesn't grab back because it's kind of weightless, almost like hitting air. And because of that, it's a little bit harder to control because the contact point is not as solid as other points in the flight of that ball. Again, going back to my tennis analogy where we have a stringed instrument and a fuzzy ball and those things grab each other really well. If I hit this ball at the peak, right at the top of that crest, it's weightless, and so it's going to grab the paddle less than any other place in that flight. And this then is one of the problems about swinging sidearm, trying to hit this ball at the top of its flight, at the top of its bounce, is that ball is almost weightless if you're hitting it right at the peak, and so it doesn't grab the paddle well. So all of the other downsides that I talked about earlier about hitting this ball flat and not grabbing the paddle well, me hitting at the top of its bounce, our brain says this is going to be a good thing to do because it may be above the net when I hit it. This ball is actually kind of weightless and it doesn't grab the paddle very well. The third option then of where to hit this ball in its flight path is after it peaks, after it crests, and now it starts to come down. The longer we can wait, the longer we can let this ball come down, it starts to gain inertia and it starts to gain some weight. So as my paddle comes at it, the ball's now coming toward my paddle and they contact each other, and the contact point is much better on average. So that is why I want this ball coming down off of that crest. Now you can say if I'm swinging sidearm, I can still swing over here to the side as this ball came down off of that crest. And that is true. There are other problems with swinging sidearm, but just because I'm swinging out the side doesn't mean I have to hit it at that high point at that crest, and we can't always do that anyway. There will be times where that ball has crested and is coming down and I'm still swinging sidearm, and so that's a better option than trying to hit this ball at its high point. Here's another reason why I want to let that ball come down off of its high point, off of that crest, and come down lower. So we already understand now that it gains momentum, it gains inertia as it's coming down, grabs the paddle a little bit better. So if I stand straight up, I'm just relaxed, my paddle's hanging down, and I want to understand where's the sweet spot of my paddle, assuming that I'm going to swing with a straight arm. You can see this down below my knee, meaning that ideally, if I'm swinging at this ball, however I swing, ideally in close, I want to have that ball down where the sweet spot of my paddle is. So if I'm letting this ball come down off of the crest and fall down to around my knee, then it's more commonly in a better location to hit the sweet spot of my paddle than if I'm out here hitting sidearm. So if I'm always hitting out here to the side, so it could be straight out or any variation of all of these, then I have all these different heights where that ball isn't coming down off that crest quite as much, and I have to be able to hit all those different heights of the ball. And yes, eventually I'm going to have to do some of that anyway, but when I have the option to control where I am and when I hit this ball and where the ball is relative to me, I would like to have that ball come down off its crest, have more speed and inertia coming toward my paddle and down to where the sweet spot of that paddle is. So if I'm standing straight up like this, that sweet spot's down below my knee a little bit, for me anyway. So more athletic stance here in my ready position with my knees bent. So you can see that that sweet spot of my paddle is even maybe a little bit lower, so I want to let that ball come down off of that high point to hit my paddle, and I have a better chance of hitting that well out of the sweet spot of my paddle. Now you can say, well, I could do the same thing out here to the side and still let that ball come down low and get all of those benefits, and that's true, you can, and sometimes you have to. You just can't get your body over where it needs to be and be crowding that ball, be close to that ball. So sometimes we have to be reaching over here to get the ball, and that's just what it is. I'm talking about those instances where I have enough time that I have the choice of I can either reach over here or I have enough time to where I could move over here and crowd this ball. In both of those cases, I'd rather have that ball low down to where the sweet spot of my paddle normally is. And I always want to be swinging with a straight arm, right? So if I'm swinging like this, then the sweet spot of the paddle is always the same distance from my shoulder. I'll turn sideways here. If I'm not hitting that ball down by my knee, down, and I'm not letting that ball come down, and I'm rushing forward, as I talked about earlier, what can happen is even if I'm crowding the ball and having it close, now the ball's not down where I want it, and I have to start doing this and bending this, and now the sweet spot of my paddle, that distance from my shoulder to that sweet spot starts to vary and things get more complicated. So if we'll stay back, let the ball come to us more often, let it come down off that crest and come down to our knee or just below our knee, then that allows us to more consistently have the straight arm, sweet spot of the paddles more consistently the same distance from my shoulder, and I don't have to do this, and then there's none of this using the bicep to do this swing. That's problematic in itself. I want to have the straight arm as I'm swinging, and that paddle's always the same distance from my shoulder. Another key difference between hitting sidearm and hitting with this ball in close and my paddle vertical is the use of my non-paddle hand. If you've watched many of my videos, you'll understand how important I think this non-paddle hand is. I want to put this out in front of the ball, and that will give me a really good reference point in 3D space about where that ball is and where I need to get my paddle to hit it well. Here's what that looks like in these two different swing positions. So if this ball's coming in close and I'm crowding this ball and I've got my non-paddle hand out here in front, essentially where that ball would hit my non-paddle hand, I have a good reference point for where this ball is, and that allows me to hit this ball better. You can see if I'm swinging here, then the sweet spot of my paddle gets that ball fairly regularly, fairly consistently. So if I'm here, I can watch this ball all the way in, and this is out in front again, and so my contact's out in front, and I can see my paddle hit that ball depending on how hard I swing. Versus when I swing sidearm, so this ball's coming in, I want my hand out where this ball would hit my hand, but because my shoulders are attached at different sides of my body, as I'm reaching over now, I have a little bit of an issue that to get this hand in front of this ball, now my paddle's too far out and I've got to bend my elbow so I no longer have a straight arm, so that sweet spot of my paddle's no longer consistently in the same spot. I can still hit it, it's still a reference point, so if I have my hand out here all the way to the side, my non-paddle hand, then my brain says, I can't reach this ball, so my paddle's got to be even further out, or if I can reach this ball, now I've got to bend my elbow. Neither one of those are the best options. The bigger thing maybe is that as I'm out here, I can no longer really look this ball into the sweet spot of my paddle. So my target has changed. I'm trying to triangulate how far out my paddle needs to be. To put this in a little bit different perspective, think if my arm's 10 feet long, it's really harder and harder to judge where my paddle needs to be relative to that ball that's 10 feet away. So the further away this gets, then the harder it is for me to look this ball into the sweet spot of the paddle. And that's another reason why swinging out here isn't as good as swinging in here, because if this ball is coming in, I can look this ball into the sweet spot of my paddle. I can see both of those and they're relatively close. Way out here then, not so much. Okay, that was a lot. But those are my thoughts around why this isn't as good. Having this paddle in this horizontal orientation, hitting this ball out to the side, versus having the ball closer to my body and hitting the ball with this paddle in a more vertical orientation. So if you stuck around, thank you for that. The rest of the videos in the series are going to be focused on how to hit this ball then, using this type of an orientation where I'm trying to get this paddle as vertical as I can get it, with this ball in as close as I can get it, with this ball down by my knee or a little bit below my knee. If I can do all those things, then my chances for success, my consistency goes up for that ball going across that net. Check the description box below for links to the other videos in this series.